that this session is being recorded, and we will place our recording on our YouTube channel. If you don't want to be recorded, it's time to drop off now. Okay, so I hope everybody had a good time taking some time. Hope everybody should have taken some time off, and Happy New Year to everyone. And we are going to be starting our regular session from this point on. So please provide feedback if you have any topic that you are interested in, or any other feedback. You can email it directly to me and zahir@microsoft.com, or our Azure Power Lunch at Microsoft.com. So both the email address are valid. So topic of today is Azure Kubernetes Service and Managed Identity. So there are a few things there that kind of sometimes seems a bit confusing. I mean, this managed identity support for different AKS feature. That's what I want to talk about. And, just as I have dealt with those features, I want to make sure that, and I got sometime I got a bit confused, like what applies to where. I just want to make sure to share it with the community, what I have learned. So first of all, what we're going to do a quick overview of the managed identity, just a couple of minutes, just so that everybody is on the same page. Then we're going to talk about managed identity support for Azure for AKS management plane. Okay, and then which is GA, it's available. And then we're going to talk about Azure AD support for pod identity in AKS, which is currently in public preview. If you remember, it used to be a community project for some time, but now it has gone into mainstream. It has become a public preview, and at some future point, it will be GA. So we are going to kind of see how each applies and what's the difference between them, and what problems they are addressing, business problems they are addressing. So first of all, managed identity. What is managed identity? Managed identity is an Azure AD feature which allows you to assign identities to Azure resources. They can be system managed identities, which are tied to a resource lifetime. Once the resource goes away, that identity goes away. Okay, then there is a user managed identity, which you can create. They're lightweight. Think of it in its core. They're lightweight service principle. I think we are familiar with Azure AD service principle. So they're lightweight service principle. You don't need any special permission to create, and that's the good thing about them. And once you can create the user managed identity, you can assign it to a resource. And one thing to keep in mind, you can assign user managed identity to multiple resources at the same time. And both have their applicable use cases. For example, as I said, system managed identity. Let's say you created a VM and it needs to the resources on that VM need to access AKS. You can create a managed identity for that VM and then give access to that key vault. That's it. Very simple. System managed identity. That's good. Any service that you run, as long as it can use managed identity, it should be able to get resources on behalf of the managed identity of the virtual machine. But let's say that you have 10, 100 VMs. They all need to access that key vault. That's where one thing you can do is assign each managed identity access policy to that key vault, but that's become really cumbersome. That's where you can use user managed identity. You can create that identity, assign it to all these VMs, and then give access to the key vault. So that's I just want to make sure everybody is on the same page with managed identities. Any questions? Okay. And by the way, just like a service principal, you have to rotate managed identities, but that is done by system itself. Azure AD rotates them every 46 days. So that's something that is already taken care of by the platform. So you don't have to worry about it. Okay. So first of all, managed identities in Azure Kubernetes Service. So this was introduced last year sometime. The goal was that when AKS cluster is created, it needs to create some other resources, like for example, load balancer for egress controller, manage this, things like that. So it needs a service principal. If you have been working with AKS, I'm sure you know that in a number of cases you had to create a service principal. You go in, you create a service principal, and then you assign it to the AKS cluster. Okay. And that was the service principle that it uses to create those resources. But the challenge with service principle is um, in some organization, not everybody can create a service principle. So that's become a headache where you have to first ask somebody to create it, some admin, and then so that kind of add administrative overhead. Second thing is you have to renew a service principle. So that causes an additional issue where if you have to renew the service principle, if you don't remember renewing it, your AKS cluster may not work as expected once that service principal is expired. Managed identity takes care of that. Once you create a cluster with managed identity, basically now that managed identity will take place of the service principal and it will create those resources on that behalf. Okay. Second thing is, as I said, managed identities, they are rotated every 46 days. So that will also take care of that issue. We don't have to worry about, rotating those resources and all that. Okay. Um, any questions? Okay. So let's quickly take a look at some of the sample code. When you are, and by the way, this managed identity addresses only the management, this feature addresses the management plane interaction. It has nothing to do with pod identities. Okay, so that's a totally separate thing that is dealing with how the management plane interaction of AKS. You can create a new cluster. The only thing that you have to do is you have to use enable managed identity flag when you are creating a new cluster, or you can create an existing cluster. In that case, or update an existing cluster. In that case, you have to do a few things as outlined. I have the link to the resources on how to do that. So that should be pretty obvious. Um, so what I'm going to show you is an existing cluster that I have. And by the way, you have the UI support for that as well. So if you are creating a cluster from the UI, as far as I know, the support is there to use managed identity. Okay, so this is a cluster that I have created. For example, this is the AKS cluster that I have created. And as you know, whenever you create an AKS cluster, it creates a separate kind of a sister resource group where it puts all the resources. This is the resource group. And this is where it is hidden in plain sight. This is the managed identity that is created by AKS behind the scene. So this is, pool managed identity that is created behind the scene to do all those. So that's the first part of our discussion. Okay. If there are no questions, I'm gonna move on to the next part, which is the more interesting piece. So, as I said, there has been a project for quite some time, open source project on how to assign managed identities to the pod. And we all know why we need that. We application runs on pod. These applications need to access other resources like keywords and things like that. Okay. You have to use connection strings, store those connection string as AKS secrets, things like that, which is not very secure anyways. And, security folks hate this kind of thing. So that's where pod identities come into picture. With that, you can assign a user managed identity to a pod, and it any application that is running on it, if it can take advantage of managed identity, it can take its identity, take advantage of that identity to access resources in an other service like Key Vault or Azure SQL, given that proper access policies are set up. This feature has just gone into public preview just before the holidays. Okay, um, it's so in this scenario, basically, you have to do a few things. First of all, you have to register this preview, the line I showed. And by the way, I have a small GitHub repo where I have outlined all that script. And I have also the links to the documentation towards the end and the resources. So, you can take a look at it, what commands you have to use. So first of all, you have to execute this command, enable pod identity preview. And this, you have to do it, and it will take somewhere 10 to 30 minutes. So just be patient, leave it running, and once it's running, check back later on to see if it has registered. It will show you the registered status. Second thing is regarding the adding the extension. So you have to add this AKS preview extension, update it, the usual stuff. Normally, you have to do it for every preview. The third, you have to use enable pod identity flag and enable managed identity flag. Okay, that's you have to do. One thing, just to keep in mind, at this point, the support is not there for KubeNet. So you have to make sure that your cluster uses CNI. Okay, so that's something you have to keep in mind. It's not documented. I mean, I think the documentation is a bit kind of misleading. I mean, it shows you the command. I think they just want to show you, okay, you have to use these flags. But the thing is, it does not work with at the present with KubeNet. So you have to use CNI. Okay, it's a preview. Once that is done, and actually, let me just share my VS Code. This is my VS Code. I hope everybody can see it. And let me just move this here. So let's go at the top. This is where you register the feature, extension, this is all boilerplate code. Just keep these two in mind. These two you have to use to enable pod and managed identity. And then what you have to do is you have to create a user managed identity. That's where I'm creating a user managed identity, AKS pod ID. Okay. I'm creating that identity, and then I'm using this command. This is a new AKS pod identity to add it as one of the available identities into the system. So now I'm saying, hey, this is an identity. I want it to make available to use in AKS for this namespace. So as you can see, this is the namespace. I mean, and this is all now AKS stuff. Let me just add a line feed here. So this is all AKS related stuff. Okay. Once that is done, then what you can do is you can basically execute an apply a YAML file and use that identity. So let's take a look at the YAML file to see what we are doing in this YAML file. So if you go back to the script, when we are registering this pod identity, we are using a special name. So this is the name of the managed identity, but in AKS, its alias is this. Okay. So we go in here, and this is your YAML file, and this is a standard YAML file. Whenever you deploy a pod, I mean, I'm deploying a pod here, I have to use this label. So this is first thing. I have to use this label. Okay. Second thing is, this is the name of the image. It can be your application image, whatever that is. Then you have the subscription ID. This is your Azure subscription ID. This is the client ID of the managed identity that I have created. So when I have created that managed identity, it gives you a client ID. That's where you get from that. And this is the resource group where that client ID is reside. I mean, where that managed identity is residing. It may be residing in a different group. The rest, again, are just environment variables, vanilla code. Don't worry about it. But this is something to remember. These are few things to remember you have to do to attach appropriately that ID. Okay. Once that is attached, now your pod will spin up with the managed identity that you have created. Okay. Everybody with me so far? Any questions? Okay. So just remember the steps. First of all, of course, you have to create the cluster. The second, you have to create a managed identity. You have to have it, okay? And the third one, you have to associate that managed or make that managed identity available inside a cluster namespace, okay? And then fourth, when you are applying the application, you will ask that, hey, use this managed identity for this pod. Okay, so that's all the steps that are needed here. And I am running a small, very simple application. Actually, this is directly from the samples, not doing very kind of a creative stuff. So what I'm doing is so I have this pod running in AKS. It is using the managed identity. Sorry for the screen flickering. These are the three lines that you need to look at. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy these lines, and I'm going to open a notepad, paste these three lines, and I'm going to increase the font size to 18 so we can take a look at that. This first line says successfully acquired the token using managed identity. So this is to prove out that now it is actually using that managed identity. The second one shows us, okay, what managed identity to use. And this is the client ID, blah, blah, blah. And the third one, basically it's just using a get, statement using that managed identity to make a call. Okay, so that's all there is to it. Um, you know, um, Kind of very simple process. Uh, Create a cluster with the managed identities and support for pod identities. Create a managed identity, assign it to the cluster as make it available as to be used by the pods. And then whenever you are deploying application, use that managed identity for, as the pod identity. So that's all there is to it. Okay, so let's quickly go back to our slide deck. I just want to show. So this is kind of a sample YAML file. It's there. You can take a look at that. It's in the documentation. One thing I want to show you, limitations. So currently, you can have up to 50 pod identities for a cluster. Okay. And then right now, pod managed identities are only available on Linux cluster. Okay. They're not available if you have Windows cluster. Not right now, hopefully in the future. So that's kind of a quick wrap up of all those two identities. And I want to show you my cluster one more time. So this is once again, so let's go into our AKS cluster. This is our namespaces. So this is my namespace where my app is running. So if I go into that, that's the namespace where my app is running. And let me just show you here. Hopefully, You can see the pods here. So this is my pod. Okay. So this is my pod that is running. I'm running a single node, and on top of the node, that's my pod. And this is the YAML for the pod that we have. I mean, that just shows the YAML to you. But but um, but the point is, if you have an app and you're using applications in AKS, now moving forward, you can take advantage of pod identities to assign identities to the pod, and user managed identities, and kind of it's pretty simple and straightforward process. Okay. Any questions? We talk about. So once again, 50 pod identities are allowed, and it's only available for Linux. So any questions, comments, feedback? Okay. So once again, thank you very much for everyone for joining. And as you know, we will post the recording and the slide deck to our YouTube channel. Please, if you have any comments, please think about it afterwards. Email us or through the chat. And hope to see everyone. I want to give everybody 7 minutes back, and hope to see everyone next week for another session of Azure Power Lunch. So thank you very much. Have a great weekend, everyone.